Hello everyone, and welcome to the very first episode of The Viper's Nest, a show where we attempt to shine a spotlight on the more obscure and lesser-known parts of various lores. And with that, we'll get right into it. Today, we are talking about the character of Dexter Whitlam from Resident Evil's WildStorm comic line. A bit of a preference about the comic line. It ran from, I believe, 1997, and technically up until 2010. But there weren't that many comics produced. It started out with the original Resident Evil official comic magazine, with art by various famous people like Jim Lee of DC fame. So, originally, the Resident Evil official comic magazine was released in an attempt to spread the word of Resident Evil to more demographics who may or may not play, video games. Which, in my opinion, is actually a really good move, especially in the late 90s, early 2000s, when a lot more people actually went out to stores to buy things like comic books. You guys remember those, right? These little things you can pick up at the store, and then you open them, and they have pretty pictures inside? Yeah. So, the character of Dexter was originally revealed in the, I believe, the third issue of the Resident Evil official comics magazine, and then crossed over into the Resident Evil Fire and Ice run, which was only about 4 issues long. So now that you know what comic books are and why Resident Evil had some comic books, let's talk about Dexter himself. So Dexter was your fairly stereotypical nerdy college student, and he had the unfortunate circumstances of being bullied by a couple of people. I have their names here. The main instigator, his name was Kelly Thorndike, which, real bully name there if you ask me. But also his friends Todd Umbenhauer and Wade Boddington III. Also, just real bully names. So, Dexter's one real source of solace was from a female friend of his named Ruthie, who would occasionally help him out and sometimes shield him from the bullies. But those instances were few and far between. So Dexter, he attempted to get real good at eluding and hiding from his bullies, which he wound up in the warehouse district of, what was the city's name again? Pine Grove, that's what it was. So during his adventures in the warehouse district of Pine Grove, after a particularly ruthless beating by the bullies, he did have a flashback of a time when he saw some dudes in Umbrella Corporation uniforms carrying something into a warehouse, and Dexter, being a naturally curious soul, sometimes returned to the warehouse district even when he wasn't getting bullied to kind of figure out what they were doing over there. And in one instance, he caught sight of them carrying in a tyrant suspended in a large tank of fluid. So he became real enamored with that tyrant, what with being, a giant, powerfully built monster and all that. So one day, after the worst beating he'd ever suffered, he went back to the warehouse district and did some scouting around. And he actually managed to snag himself a syringe full of G-Virus. So he hung on to this G-Virus, and eventually got his ass whooped again, as bullies tend to do. So Dexter made it a point making the connection between the tyrant and the virus. He figured the virus could give him an edge over his bully. So not only did Dexter study the G-Virus in depth, he was actually smart enough to go and modify said virus. And then, once the bullies found him again, he injected himself with the modified strain of the G-Virus, and he transformed into this very attractive creature. So having mutated and gained a very obvious advantage over his bullies, he began stalking and brutally killing them. I believe he ripped the guts out of one and put another one's head through a vending machine. And this eventually culminated with him finding his aggressor, Mr. Kelly Thorndike himself. But he also ran into his friend Ruthie, and Ruthie begged Dexter to, not viciously kill Kelly Thorndike, because that would be the humane thing to do, but Dexter decided balls to that nonsense, and he brutally ripped Kelly Thorndike apart. It was at this point that he was snuck upon and disabled by 2 people working for the Umbrella Corporations, the scientist Klaus and Klaus's henchman, only known as Mr. Venk. So they disabled old Dexter with a spark shot, which if you played Resident Evil 2, you would know that's one of the optional weapons that Claire Redfield can find in her campaign. So they took the mutated Dexter to a hospital, and after a whole lot of surgery and therapy, they actually managed to bring Dexter back into a more human appearance. And I use that term very, very loosely, because even after he was, I guess, unmutated, he was not a pretty sight. But Klaus, being impressed with Dexter's ingenuity and his modification of the G-Virus, offered him a job with the Umbrella Corporation, which Dexter happily took. And it was at this point that Dexter was transferred to the Arctic facility of the Umbrella Corporation, where he began work on something called the X-Virus. And there, Dexter spent quite a long time just doing what you do when you're an Umbrella Corporation scientist, when he was met by the newly formed STARS Charlie team. And he ended up capturing some of them and experimenting on them as well. But Dexter was eventually killed when a surveillance drone, piloted by the last remaining member of STARS Charlie team, got close enough to him to self-destruct. And that was the end of poor Dexter Whitlam. So that's the story of Dexter Whitlam. I actually really liked this character when I read it. It draws a lot from the whole, person gets bullied, person gets power over bully, yada yada yada, but unlike a lot of those stories where normally when confronted with the potential love interest begging the newly formed monster to not be a monster, said monster realizes, oh my god, I am the monster now. What have I done? Oh no. But Dexter didn't go that path. No, he just decided, nope, this is what I am now. So he killed the bully, and then he was eventually going to kill Ruthie herself in a, interesting inversion of the normal writing trope. But obviously he didn't, since he was captured by the Umbrella Corporation. But, yeah, the comics line, it's a very cool comic line. I highly recommend you go and seek it out if you can. I know Capcom released, an anthology, I think back in, 2009, 2010 or something like that. It was meant to parallel the release of Resident Evil 5. I don't actually know how much those cost, but I highly recommend you read them. You should keep in mind that the WildStorm comic line has been declared non-canon at this point, since a lot of the comics were actually being written as the games were coming out. So there's a lot of discrepancy between the main Resident Evil timeline, which they call the Prime timeline, and then they've segregated this off into the WildStorm timeline. They also have another timeline in the form of the S.D. Perry novels, which I'm going to cover a bit of those in my next video. But those, just like the comics, were also being written as the games were released. Like a big example from there would be how Leon joined an underground resistance movement against the Umbrella Corporation, mainly because Resident Evil 4 didn't exist at that point. I don't even think it was in pre-production at the time the fourth S.D. Perry novel came out. But it's still all very well written, very readable. I highly suggest you go and check it out. And with that, we will end the video here. Thank you for hanging out and taking a quick look at one of the very, very, very obscure characters from a fairly obscure comic line in the Resident Evil lore. So, thank you for your time. I hope you enjoyed it, and I will see you on the next one. Please leave a like and subscribe if you liked. Comment down below if you have any ideas of any other lore tidbits you would like me to shine a light upon. You have yourself a good day.